the empire machine is also the drug pusher. It's the thing that keeps selling us the next fix, the next distraction, basically the next artificial substitute for what we really want. Media does really well with this, providing us with distractions. I would say that it's one of the main jobs is to distract us, and of course it's handled most eloquently by the entertainment industry. Is there, more or less to distract us. We're not to say that there aren't beautiful films and that the whole system, within the system there aren't anomalies, but for the most part it's there to help us be distracted, because of course we want to be distracted. It's not all sort of the fault, if you would, of the entertainment industry. The other thing that, besides distraction, that the media provides is deception. This is handled mostly by mainstream news, but there are lots of other ways in which, again, this cultural coding comes across. There are other ways in which the main ideas of our culture are put across to deceive us into what the empire machine thinks is important. And then finally, disempowerment, which is really the job of the advertising industry. Advertising is essentially predicated on one model, one directive, which is to tell us that we're not enough. We're not good enough. We're not smart enough. We're not sexy enough. We're not young enough. We're not rich enough. We're not healthy enough. All of those things are basically variations on the same theme, that we're not enough. But thank goodness we have, if you buy this product, if you buy this thing, you can be enough. This is the promise that every ad ever created holds out for you, is that you will be a more complete human being if you have this thing. But if you know anything about addiction, of course, it's that it will not make you happy, and it cannot make you happy. What addiction does is it provides basically a temporary fix. It provides the illusion of happiness. It provides pleasure. It provides momentary pleasure. It provides the illusion of happiness. It's a false substitute, in other words, for what we really want, what we're really yearning for, and what we need to be happy. Basically, if any of this, anything we ever created as a species, one has to imagine that it was done for the sake of human happiness, or at least that was the original intent. If not, what is the point? I don't know. So let's just assume that happiness is the goal here. And I would like to make the case that the empire machine is not capable of making us happy, and in fact, it's not designed to make us happy. So what would the phrase that I like to say is that if you happen to be happy, it's not because of the system; it's despite the system. Somehow you figured out a way to be happy despite all of the incessant instructions to take the false substitute at every chance that you can. So what do we really need to be happy? Well, it's actually pretty simple. But I'm trying to make the case that our society makes it very difficult, actually. It's really simple. What do we need? We need a certain amount of physical safety and health and security. Despite the fact that we have the biggest military budget in history, generally most of us don't feel very secure. And I'm kind of making the case that that's the point. We're not supposed to feel. It's meant to make us feel insecure. Think about what's the biggest, the new, as of 10 years ago, what's the scariest thing around? Terrorism, right? That's the thing that we're supposed to be afraid of. Before it was communism and it was different things, but now it's terrorism. So everyone, in any context, in the news and so forth, they're telling you you should be very afraid. Be very afraid of these terrorists. I know my mom is deathly afraid of terrorism, You know, she doesn't like me to fly and all these kinds of things. But no one is going around saying, you should never drive a car. It's so freaking dangerous to drive a car. You know, how many people per year die in acts of terrorism compared to how many people die in a car crash or prescription painkillers, for example? But people say, no, buy the prescription painkillers, buy the car, you know, that's where the money is. And that's where the money is in feeding the illusion of fear, which is not to say that terrorism doesn't exist, but that it's so blown out of proportion as to create this endless kind of insecurity. So how does that contribute to our well-being? How about our physical well-being, our health? You know, our society in particular is just mired in ill health. You know, we're a nation of fast food. All you have to do is look at the diet for the average school child. It's atrocious. It's really bad food that we're feeding our kids, and these are the kids who are going to grow up to be our leaders, our people in our society. So our society sort of feeds us these things that are dangerous. You know, I mean, you could get into GMO foods and all that kind of stuff that is potentially bad as well. But the way I see it, it's actually designed to, the goal is to, not to kill people, nor, because then you can't make any money off of a dead person, but nor is it to be healthy. We don't want people to be healthy either. We want people to be stuck in this kind of middle ground where we rely on the prescription meds and we rely on the medical system to basically keep giving us more drugs. You know, right behind the oil industry, of course, the most profitable industry in the world is the pharmaceutical industry. So there's a huge incentive to keep people sort of at a low level of health. You know, not enough to kill you, but not enough to cure you. Second thing we need to be happy: friends and community. You know, through the destruction of the social commons, I think the Empire Machine destroys community as well. I mean, how many of us here, how many people know their neighbors really well? Not many people know their neighbors. And the reason that we don't know our neighbors is because we don't need our neighbors anymore. We can kind of fake it, we can try to make small talk or whatever and pretend that we're interested in them, but when it comes down to it, they'll be, the new neighbor who moves in is just going to be the same neighbor, somebody we don't really need, because whatever that neighbor can provide, we can get elsewhere, or we can pay for it. So, you know, this is in contrast to the way things were hundreds of years ago, where people relied on one another for building community and for their lives to be rich and full. Another thing that we need to be happy is a sense of purpose, a sense of doing the thing that we love to do in service of what we feel to be our calling. All of us have this intuition at one time or another that we are here for a reason. We were incarnated at this particular time and in this body with these certain talents and these certain skills to make ourselves useful in some way. And many of the world's religions talk about how the highest virtue is to be of service. And most of us know from experience that it feels really good to be. But our society is focused on competition and one-upmanship and who's better, and cooperation is not exactly the catchphrase, the operating principle. In our society, basically your worth, your sense of being, your purpose is essentially to contribute to GDP. That's basically the measure of your worth. And if this sounds a little simplistic or harsh, you know, I encourage you to think about indigenous communities around the world who are, as we speak, being removed from their land, some of them being exterminated and killed, and who have historically, that's basically been the pattern, right? Why does that happen? It's simply because those people are not contributing to GDP. It's really as simple as that. I mean, yes, there's some racism and all kinds of stuff going on in there as well, but the main reason that they're standing in the way of progress, right? Of the growth of the Empire Machine. That's the problem. And finally, what we need to be happy is a sense of belonging. The sense that we belong somewhere. And I argue that the Empire Machine is dedicated to making us feel like we don't belong. And I'm just going to read one little couple sentences of mine from the book. We moderns have been made to feel forsaken and out of place, not only in our prefabricated houses and soulless apartments, not only in our claustrophobic work cubicles and stultifying jobs, not only in the cities and towns where we live alongside so many strangers, but also in the cosmos at large. We have been taught by science that our lives are random accidents, and by religion that we're completely unlike and vastly superior to other terrestrial creatures, and that we don't belong to the earth, but that the earth belongs to us. So again, we can look at the prevalence of addiction among native communities and indigenous communities. Disproportionately high, off the charts when you compare it to people who have not been displaced. Most of those people have been actively displaced, and it also happens. It's a very high rate of addiction in people who have been shuffled from one place to another in their childhood, people from juvenile halls or shuffled between jails, or foster homes, foster kids. The rate of addiction goes up exponentially when people are displaced. And there's an interesting side note here, which is that the rise in substance abuse in the world corresponds almost directly with the rise of industrialism. So before the Middle Ages and during the Middle Ages, there weren't addiction was a relatively isolated thing. I mean, every once in a while you'd have like your town drunk, right? You'd have somebody who was a little out of control, one in 1,000 people maybe. And then with the rise of colonialism and capitalism, the rate started to go up really high, and they became kind of a thing, a trend. And then by the time the Industrial Revolution came, there was a massive spike. And the massive Industrial Revolution corresponds with just this kind of outbreak of addiction in cultures all across the planet. So, you can even make the case that it just corresponds with capitalism in general, addiction. So finally, there's the question of how do we recover? How does one recover from addiction? And again, there are different strategies and models. Typically, it happens in one of three ways. There's we hit bottom. One hits bottom, right? Things get horribly bad, irreparably bad sometimes. Loss of relationships, family, life and limb. Very, very often hitting bottom involves a literal choice between life and death. So the question at our time now is like, are we there yet? Have we hit bottom in our addictive process, or do we still have a ways to go? And it's kind of impossible to say. Another way that it happens, it's the most effective but the least likely to happen, is what I call raising the bottom, which is essentially raising consciousness and pointing out to somebody, like, if you continue going on this with this set of behaviors, you're going to end up, here's where you're going to end up. It doesn't look pretty. If you can instill in somebody that kind of awareness, often an addiction can kind of turn around and they say, well, I don't want that to happen. I don't want to lose all of my teeth and from meth and whatever it is. I don't want to go there. I don't want to look like a living corpse. I want to be a human being. So often it can be effective, but there's something strange about human nature that almost requires the situation to get really difficult. Very few of us make major changes in our life unless a major crisis happens. And the third thing that happens third way that addiction is overcome is through intervention. So intervention is also not very effective, at least traditional intervention. Traditional intervention means that people or a group of people come in, the person who's addicted, they take them out of their normal environment and then they put them in a clinic or something so they can get sober, and there's education and things that happen during that time. But then the person goes back to their situation, and all the triggers are still there, basically, and the amount of relapse, the instance of relapse is really, really high. And it's partly because the impetus for change was not coming from that person, generally. It was imposed from the outside. So in our culture, intervention would look like revolution, essentially. It would look like the 99% or the 99.9% rising up and saying, we can't, this is unsustainable, we care about other living creatures on the earth, we care about the future of our children and so forth, we have to stop this. But I would also say that we have to be careful in that instance not to make it something that is imposed upon the powers that be, but rather like in a compassionate, in a more compassionate, more holistic kind of intervention, the family of the addict will actually go through the process as well. Because there's an understanding that everyone in the family has some responsibility for the addiction. There's some role that they play in enabling the person or whatever they do. It's an understanding that it's a whole system, and it's not just like the fault of the person that is some kind of moral failing on their part. There's an understanding that it's a systemic thing. And that's kind of the approach that I advocate, is that if and when we get to the point of global revolution, that it's done in such a way that each one of us is at the same time sort of examining our own three poisons, our own addictive tendencies, and we're going through the rehabilitation ourselves. Because of course we're all part of it. We feed the empire machine with all of our, again, unconscious impulses. So there's of course the model of the 12-step program, and I talk about it in the book on as best I can on the collective level. Like, what would it look like? What would the 12 steps look like as a society? And they can be broken down into actually 6 steps. The first of which is admitting lack of control. So, you know, a lot of people think, well, the way to end addiction is you assert your willpower, and you just don't do that. It turns out it doesn't work, and the reason why that doesn't work is because control is the problem in the first place. Addiction is a way to control one's feelings and one's environment and one's inner states. So you're already imposing control, and you want to impose more control. It doesn't work. You have to give up. As they say in AA, let go and let God. That's the phrase that people use. Second thing is to recognize a higher power. I prefer the term greater power because I don't want to go back into the hierarchy thing. A greater power is something of which we partake, but is more than us, or is us on a collective level. And even more than that, I prefer terms that are that can be accessed by people who are not necessarily religious as well. So what might that be? Well, a higher power that seems pretty accessible to most people is nature. Yeah, just the idea and the recognition that we are part of nature and that it sustains us and that we need nature in the most fundamental sense. We can also take some refuge in the power of people, the power of community, the power of the whole living democracy movement. We can put our energies and efforts in there as the greater power to which we look for inspiration. And then there's a more abstract kind of truth power, or satyagraha, that Gandhi talked about as being one of the more powerful forces into which we can tap, and we can find some strength to move forward. A third thing would be examining our past errors. On a collective scale, this would be difficult, but it would involve acknowledgement of all of the genocide, the slavery, the torture, the rape, the subjugation of native peoples, the disenfranchisement of minorities. All of that would need to become part of our collective, our everyday discourse. It would have to be an awareness, even, we would have to be living in this country, for example, we would have to be aware every day that we're living on land that is not ours, essentially, that we appropriated, and at great expense to many, many people, native people. And then, and actually, as weird as it sounds, there are actually things that are happening and have happened in the last decade or so that show that this kind of awareness is just starting to dawn. There have been public apologies for the incarceration of Japanese during World War II, for example. There have been public apologies for slavery, actually, the slavery of Africans in America. And there's been apologies from the Australian government about the treatment of Aborigines. So it's not. You can argue maybe those things don't go a long way, but they do. I see them as steps in the healing process. And then finally, there's learning a new. Fifth, learning a new code of behavior. Basically, the new code is what I've been talking about: abandoning this dominator model of our society and moving towards this partnership model. And then finally, there's the idea of helping others to recover. That's the sixth step in the scheme here. And in this, we can talk about the wounded healer archetype, and we can talk about the bodhisattva archetype. And I'll just read a beautiful little quotation by Charles Eisenstein. That's from his book Ascent of Humanity, and he says, "One way or another, we must weep for all of this. What goes for the crimes of humanity, nations, and cultures goes as well for us individually. Even as we appreciate our nobility and tend gently to our wounds, so also must we lament the violence, the scarring, the ruin of the other that has sprung from our separation, if ever we are to become whole. The bodhisattva path, to remain in samsara until all beings are free, is more than a noble sacrifice. It is an organic necessity." So the last little thing I want to talk about is a kind of recovery model that comes from the Buddhist tradition. So again, this whole thing is kind of based on this anatomy of the elements of empire is based on a Buddhist teaching. And of course, all of the three poisons have their antidotes, right? They have the things that we can practice, at least on an individual level, to overcome our personal addictions. So for materialism and greed, there is the antidote of the most active antidote, of course, is generosity. Living out of the spirit of the gift, giving away as much as we can for free, our time, our energy, our love, our resources, just inhabiting the spirit of the gift. There's also the idea of, to combat this materialism greed, the idea of contentment. The idea that each one of us is enough. Each one of us is in fact wealthy enough and beautiful enough and smart enough, and that we have enough, that we are enough. We can sort of learn how to cultivate this idea, and in the old days they used to call it just counting your blessings. Rather than saying, oh, there's this wrong and this wrong, the other thing wrong, and God finally had this, and finally had that. It's just a little flip of the mind that we can all practice on a daily basis that says, wow, think about all the things for which I'm really grateful for right now. All the awesome things happening in my life. It's another way. It's a way to combat this sense of lack. And for militarism and hatred, of course, actively practicing compassion. And another antidote is, for me, is inner strength. So militarism, and as I was saying, is it's a false sense of security. It's a sense of sort of insecurity, you might say. We have a national insecurity instead of national security, and and obviously the process of killing all the bad guys out there is an infinite process. Like an addiction, you're never going to reach that state. You're never going to kill all the bad guys, which our current war on terror promises to do. So it's quite naturally and conveniently an eternal war. We will be engaged in this particular war until the end of time, as far as I can tell. And that's certainly the hope of those who are immensely profiting from the war, from the so-called war on terror. So we can develop inner strength. How do we do that? Well, actually, it happens by turning inward and confronting the demons within us. So learning to face and to confront and to befriend, in some ways, those parts of us that are the most frightening, that are the most threatening. And of course, that's the only way that we in ourselves can have this sense of security that we so much long for. And then finally, there's the antidotes to media, or the delusion aspect, which is we can, in our own lives, we can practice truth-telling, being truthful, being honest, being having a certain amount of personal authenticity, and being real in a sense. Our culture doesn't really encourage that, but we can very subversively practice that. When somebody asks us how we're doing, we can reply with a certain kind of honesty, or we can at least, for those that we really love, at least we can pretend to, we can stop pretending that everything is okay, you know, that we have everything under control, that we're invulnerable and we've got our shit together, you know. I mean, we can share with one another our humanity, our weaknesses, our vulnerabilities. We can make those part of everyday discourse. And then finally, the most potent antidote to this media and delusion is wisdom, but a specific kind of wisdom, the wisdom of our interconnection, the wisdom of our interbeing. And this goes completely against the narrative that we're taught every day to believe, that we're in competition with one another and that we're isolated individuals, you know, scrapping out our own existence, and it's me against you, and all of that. That's the primary narrative driving our culture. But so it's totally subversive to try to live within the awareness of our interconnection. And it's tough. I mean, we all, in some ways, we all know, our hearts kind of know this, and our minds don't know this. The heart is kind of a unitive organ, and the mind, you know, even with its two hemispheres, is a kind of dualistic organ. It wants to have something to fight against and with, and so it's hard for us to maintain this. But the main reason is because society is telling us at every turn that this is not the case. That we are isolated. We are alone. And of course we need all these things to cure that aloneness. I mean, after all, what is the most effective strategy of empire? Divide and conquer, right? It's worked since day one and continues to work. That's why it's used in such a widespread fashion, is because it's so completely effective. If you can convince the average person not to direct his or her anger towards the people in power, but rather towards the other people, his peers, and even better, people who are even more disenfranchised than he might be. Minorities, women, blacks, homosexuals, you name it. Those are the people who are causing all the problems. You know, and if you really got to understand that, because that's, you know, who you need to be angry with. You know, whatever you do, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain, right? That's essentially the strategy that's been working and continues to work in our culture. But of course, it's, you know, people are looking behind the curtain. They're slowly waking up, and they're saying, you know, we're not going to do this anymore. You know, we need to acknowledge the humanity within one another, and as a species, kind of come together and make this happen. So I want to end on probably already gone. Yeah, I've been talking for quite a while. But I want to end on a kind of more explicitly spiritual note. You know, it's said that the only pathway out of addiction is a spiritual path, and that's part of what I'm advocating here. And the best description that I've seen for addiction is that it's a substitute for intimacy. So intimacy, strangely enough, is what we want most, but it's what we're the most afraid of. And of course, it's obvious, like the fear of intimacy with others. Fear of intimate relationships, for example, is pretty common. But what I want to get at is the fear that we have of intimacy with ourselves, and intimacy with the present moment, basically. We are so accustomed to just turning away from the present moment over and over again. You can even make the case that the whole arc of history is just human beings turning away from their own experience and then their own pain and inflicting it on others. That is the arc of history, essentially. I think we're waking up from history. And that's one of the things we need to do is to learn how to confront what Viktor Frankl called the existential void. The existential void is this feeling, it's a nebulous but very uncomfortable feeling that we have, that we don't want to be with ourselves and with our present experience. For me, it often crops up most, it shows itself most commonly at like 3 in the morning when I wake up, and my rational mind is not really there to protect against this feeling. And it's this feeling of kind of dread, anxiety, fear. It has a lot of components to it. Worry, but it can't be really named by any particular feeling. That's why I love this term, the existential void. It's also called existential vacuum, I should say. It's also called the void we avoid, because that's what our primary impulse is to avoid that feeling, and our culture is very good at helping us to avoid that feeling. I would almost argue that that's the main function of the machine that we've created, is to keep us distracted. And of course, the machine also exploits that feeling by sort of making it bigger, and more fear, and more anxiety, and more not enoughness. And then, of course, it's happy to sell you all the things that are supposed to fill up the void. It will just sell you one thing after another to fill the existential void. And of course, it's not going to work. In fact, that just makes, putting material goods into the existential void actually just makes it bigger. It makes the situation even worse. Which serves the empire machine very well. So for me, this is where spiritual practice comes in, and for me, it's meditation. Meditation has always been kind of the royal road to personal intimacy. It's just the practice of being present with whatever's happening, no matter how uncomfortable it is, no matter how much we want to turn away. It's not easy. That's why they call it a practice, and it's an ongoing practice. No one ever gets it right, but it's something that for me really helps me to abide more comfortably in the void, and at the same time sort of lessens the void as well. And it's kind of what I'm getting to. And another, but one doesn't necessarily have to have a formal meditation practice. It happens in lots of different ways. Another really powerful antidote is being in nature, just being outdoors in a wild area. So a lot of people have heard of nature deficit disorder, this kind of supposedly new thing. Our whole culture has nature deficit disorder, I think. We mostly live in cities. Over 50% of human beings live in cities now. 100 years ago, it was only 10%, and the number's growing. So estimates are 75% within the next 20, 30 years. Everyone's going to the cities, and of course, what happens? Well, we lose not only connection to nature, but we can't see the stars anymore. We have no connection to our literal our ancestors, the place from which we came. We can't see them. We can't see the stories that those stars represent. And we're increasingly more and more getting all of our cues socially. You know, and none of our inspiration, or less and less of our inspiration from nature. But as we all know, there's like enormous healing potential there. Of course, the most obvious thing is simply just that feeling of relaxation that you get when you go. Why do people make the drive out of the city to go to Marin or wherever? It's because it relaxes them. Nature has this natural healing ability that allows the body to relax, to feel at peace. Not only that, in nature there's a sense of belonging. So I was talking about before how, in some ways, the Empire Machine deprives us of the sense of belonging. And my theory is that indigenous communities, people who still live relatively close to the earth, they don't have the existential void. They feel, because they belong, their sense of belonging in that place and to that place remains. So they know the song of every bird. They know the call of every animal, the way it sounds as it moves through the forest. They know every plant and how it works. They know who was born over on that hill over there. They know who made love under that tree over there. They know who died in that river. They know all of these things that we as modern human beings don't know. We have this sense of, our sense of belonging, the existential void comes, I think, in part. It's a symptom of not having the sense of belonging. And then finally, we have the sort of greatest, what I think is the greatest spiritual treasure from meditation and from nature, which is freedom. You know, what I've been basically trying to argue is that our system, even though its sort of primary objective is freedom, you know, that it's essentially an apparatus of slavery, various kinds. So in those beautiful moments of relaxation and belonging, we have also this sense of freedom. And it's interesting to note that the first word for freedom in the English language is amargi. It comes from Sumeria. And amargi literally means return to mother. So you can imagine, you know, like when a slave was released, he or she went back to his family of origin. So when we spend time in nature, we're going back to our family of origin. We're going back to our mother, the great mother. We're going back to the creative matrix from which we came. So it's not surprising that we feel nurtured by nature, that we feel rejuvenated. We no longer feel the hole inside because we are connected to the whole outside and the whole inside. W-H-O-L-E. The whole becomes the whole. You know, it becomes the place where we can abide. We feel in touch with our soul. We feel in touch with our own intrinsic holiness. Not the hole that cannot be filled, but the hole that is also completely full. So my prayer, I'm just going to end with the thought/prayer that we all find ways to connect with and maintain our connection to that holiness within each of us. And that's all I have to say for tonight. I welcome your questions, your comments, and yes, thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Darrin. There are a lot of rich ideas there, and I have so many questions, but I'm going to choose one. You spoke about David Graeber, the anthropologist who wrote this book on debt, the first 5,000 years, and he makes this connection that you spoke about between the emergence of the axial religions and the invention of coinage. And that was one of the major points in his book that really struck me as a bit of a revelation. I had never really considered that before. And what I'm especially inspired by in your work is drawing from Buddhism, a world religion. And by world religion, I mean a religion that is not unique to one culture, but that has crossed cultural borders, national borders, and has taken root on every continent. I think Buddhism is an important wellspring to draw from to provide us with meaning once we've unplugged from the empire machine. Because there are ways in which we can withdraw from the machine and that we don't have any sustenance to fill in the gaps that we had been turning to the various addictions that can be fed to us by the machine. So Buddhism provides a way of doing that. You mentioned the way that hierarchy has worked its way into many religious traditions. You know, in the West, certainly the way that the Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire sort of took the Christian symbolic matrix and used it to the ends of expanding empire and dominating peoples is a sort of conversion of religion into empire that we all know pretty well. It even happens in Buddhism. When Buddhism first came to Tibet, Tibet was an empire that extended into China and north into Mongolia, and but there's always a tension though. There was a tension with Buddhism and the old Bon religion in Tibet, and this was around, I guess, the 7th and 8th century. There's a tension in early Christianity and the Roman Empire. I mean, one of my favorite stories in the Bible, in the Gospels, is one of the few times that Jesus, this really peaceful, holy man, gets angry is when he goes into the temple and turns over the money changers' tables. He even made a whip of some roots that he found in the garden outside. He was actually whipping these guys. So you can see in this sort of early indigenous Christianity something very similar to the Occupy movement's response to our current empire. And so I guess what I would like to hear more from you about is what happens to the sort of spiritual roots of the world's religious traditions that allows empire to co-opt them to its own interests. You know, one of my metaphors to try to understand that process is Bergson's idea of the mystics sort of being like this white hot lava that emerges from the core of cosmogenesis, and then over time it just sort of gets solidified and crusted and becomes rock. And we always need that impulse of the mystical, sort of the prophets and the spiritual teachers to remind society that we can't get stuck in dogmas or hierarchical structures or what have you. So I wonder how you make sense of the way that religion can so often be co-opted by empire.
Well, I think it's important to remember that a lot of religions were founded within structures of empire. Mm-hmm. Those structures were already very, very much in place, and I think in the book I actually make the case that this structure in some ways comes before the concept. Mm-hmm. That it's perhaps even inevitable that to a certain degree the actual religions, especially when empire was really starting to get going, that they just sort of borrowed that structure, the structure of hierarchy and the structure of, and to answer your question, I think it's just a fundamental psychological impulse among human beings that there is a father figure who is going to take care of us, and that he's going to meet our needs, and somehow that almost inevitably translates into a kind of hierarchical power structure. And so it's tied, you know, it's a complex question and a rich one that has to do with patriarchy and lots of different things. But I share your fascination with, particularly with Christianity, which one could argue is the premier religion of empire, and how it got co-opted. And I write about this in the book, about how it became converted more or less from a religion of peace and forgiveness into a religion of empire, and how that completely changed the look and the feel of Christianity into something almost unrecognizable. And there are very particular historical developments that led to that. But I don't know, maybe this is all my elaborate way of saying I'm not sure. I don't know. But
well, thanks for the elaboration. Then.
Yeah, it's rich to speculate on that.
Yeah.
Josh?
I was moved by a lot of what you said, and I'm curious, when I had only read the title of the forthcoming book, if I was a bit more on the Derek Jensen tear all of civilization down as fast as possible side of things, I might pick up your book and say, oh, against the empire machine, oh, the final cause, and see, and hope that there was more in there about, and I'm sort of curious how much is in there, about sort of, yeah, it's desperate enough that we need to sort of dismantle it as fast as possible by whatever means necessary, and be sort of against part of it, and the finality of it, and how much you sort of run in that direction with what you're
Yeah. Well, the title is, of course, meant to be somewhat provocative. It's meant to be a kind of clarion call sort of thing. What I'm referencing in particular, to answer your question in a brief way, is to say that it's not explicit, but it's implicit in the book. I don't explicitly say we need to stop the empire machine in such and such a way. But I do make the case that the transition has to be made, or we will become unrecognizable as a species. We will either literally be gone from the gene pool, or we will be an unrecognizable species that most of us would not enjoy being part of.
Yeah, so there's a finality
Yeah.
to it. How
So,
much are you making the empire the enemy?
Well, the reason that I, one of the main reasons that I really favor this model of addiction that I've talked so much about is that for me, it's a way of explaining what I was talking about at the beginning, this resistance that we all feel, and that we externally, internally, to making these changes. It explains to me, I mean, in some ways, it's a way to talk about the question of evil. In some ways, it's a way to understand the problem of, are there really some really, really, really bad people out there who actually want this to happen? It sure seems that way. It really does. But instead of collapsing completely into that mentality, I leave it a little bit more open, some room for compassion. So the appropriate response to addiction is compassion, because it's born out of pain. So in my understanding, the people who are in positions of wealth and power are the most addicted. They're the big brother in the family who has the problem, in our human family, who has a serious, serious problem. So serious that when it's pointed out to him, he reacts very violently. He doesn't want to hear it, not only because he's literally addicted, but because his whole identity is predicated on the wealth and power that defines his identity. Wealth and power are, by their very nature, are addictive. So I make the case in the book that it's not greedy people who end up in those positions. It's our society creates wealthy and greedy people. It's a natural human impulse that we all have as one of the three poisons to be desirous and that's totally natural. But what our society does is it glorifies that impulse to the nth degree. It takes all of the three poisons, and instead of saying, oh, this is part of human nature, but these can be problematic, it says, no, let's celebrate them and really make them flourish as much as possible. So the addiction piece for me is a way to not only frame and look at the people in power, but also so that it's a way for me to have compassion for myself when I get sucked into endless distraction or whatever it is that the Empire Machine is very good at what it does. It's had 5,000 years to perfect its techniques, and it's really, really efficient and works really well. So it's a way for me to have compassion of well, why don't I make the change? Why aren't I fully living the values that I talked about and that I love to see in others? And so I'm kind of dancing around your question a little bit, but it's a good one. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that I'm trying to walk the line between, yeah, man, there's a real big problem, and we gotta trash the whole system. And okay, let's have some compassion for the situation that we find ourselves in, and for those who are caught. Because my genuine gut feeling is that there are very, very few people. If there are people who are evil, they're very, very few of them. Very few of them. And most of those who are in wealth and power are simply, they just want to be in the club, and they're addicted, and they see their own worth in wealth and power and so forth. And if you could sit down with them at brunch and sort of speak to them on a heart-to-heart level, they would understand.
That's extremely good news.
Well, it's just an intuition I have. I'm not sure. I mean, one could also make the case that well, actually, I do make the case in the book that our society sort of creates and rewards sociopathy, sociopaths. It's again the machine wants to make us into machines. So the people who are most machine-like, the most devoid of human feeling, are going to be the ones who are. And a recent study actually that I read actually confirmed this when they looked at surveyed a certain number of CEOs where they found that the usual rate of sociopathy is like 3% or something in the population, but it was much higher. So yeah.
So as I'm listening to you answer Josh's question, a couple of things come to mind for me in a question. One is that I like the life against the machine. The word against is kind of interesting because we are often tempted then to use the word enemy, and I love the no enemies. Ultimately, peace is about having no enemies. And then a language that I've sort of come up with recently around reframing the idea of an enemy is competing potentialities. And what you're saying is none of us want the potentiality of the Empire Machine. We all want life. We're all alive, we're living. And so I know it's a more provocative title, but I'm wondering if underneath it's the common cause, not necessarily the final cause, because it will never ultimately attainable because there's 3 poisons and we need balance, but it's the cause that can potentially unite us through our different movements and blah, blah, blah.
I like that. I like it. And the only thing I would say is that I was really going for the double entendre because I'm talking not only about our cause in the kind of political sense, but in the language of Aristotle, the final cause means the purpose of something. It means what is this thing here for? So you have your efficient cause and your material cause and so on. But the fourth one is the final cause. What is the purpose of any given thing? So I'm trying to make the case that it is our, what's that?
I said that will get lost on a lot of most people. Look at your cover.
Probably. I mean, I explained it right away in the first, but yeah, you're right. It will probably be more attractive to those who see that political piece. But I'm kind of making the case that our final cause is not only our final cause in terms of the extinction of our species as we know it, but also it's the purpose of human life. One of the things that we're implicitly missing in our culture is that sense of purpose. And if we can find a way to unite under the banner of, say, democracy and life, that will not only nourish us and provide us with the thing that we most desperately yearn for, but also it will, for lack of a better term, save the planet. So it's a way to fold those two things together.
Darrin,
Yes.
I want to thank you so much, and we're over time, and I think it's really important that this conversation continue, and I, even in this room, in an unofficial capacity, but I feel like we should come to an official end.
Okay.
And then carry on if I have a feeling that impulse is in the room.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
I guess
Darrin.
everyone should clap. Yeah, I'm sorry I went as long.